The air trembles with the cry of steel. A crimson sun bleeds over the ruins of the Forum, where smoke rises from broken marble and the scent of ash clings to history. Beneath that dying light stands a young man, his armor cracked, his breath slow, his gaze fixed on the horizon not of Rome, but of eternity. Around him the empire quivers, torn by its own glory. This is the twilight of the Caesars, the end of gods and men made of the same fragile dust. He whispers a single word almost to himself, Julianus. And in that name echoes the burden of centuries of emperors and heirs, of blood spilled to hold a dream together. If stories like these still stir the embers of history within you, walk with us and remember to subscribe, so the past is never silenced. The city was quiet when the soldiers came, not the silence of peace, but that dreadful listening stillness before something breaks. A dog barked once somewhere near the Palatine, and then even that fell away. From the high windows of the imperial palace, the glow of torches swam against the black marble, their light moving like ghosts through corridors once meant for triumph. Inside, the scent of incense lingered, thick, sweet, suffocating. It mixed with the iron tang of fear. Servants whispered prayers behind their hands as the soldiers passed, the glint of their helmets flickering like distant lightning. They came for the blood of a family, the last living kin of Constantine the Great. Among the shadows, a child watched. Julian, barely 6 years old, hair the color of bronze, eyes too old for his small, frightened face. He clutched the hand of his half-brother Gallus as the echoes of armored feet rolled closer. He could not understand the words being shouted, only the sound of his mother's muffled sobs and the dull cry of a door being broken open. History would call it the massacre of the princes. To Julian, it was the night the gods went silent. Later, when the torches had burned low, when the palace smelled of blood and oil, the boy was found trembling beneath a marble table, staring at a pair of sandals still slick with crimson. His father's, his uncle's, all gone. A soldier's voice, low, almost kind, said, "Not this one. He's just a child." And so the lineage lived on, not by glory, but by mercy. Julian was taken east into exile. Through the dust and chill of the Anatolian highlands, he learned the language of silence, how to smile when watched, how to hide his thoughts behind the calm of his face. His mother, Basilina, tried to keep faith alive in him, but the wounds were deep. When she died soon after, the world seemed to fold in on itself. He was alone now, last of the Julian line, heir to both faith and ruin. In the villages near Nicomedia, he studied by lamplight. Scrolls of Homer, Plato, and Hesiod, the old gods whispering from parchment. Outside, the new Rome thundered with sermons and conversions. Constantine had turned the empire toward the Galilean, and men now knelt beneath a single cross instead of 1,000 idols. But for Julian, the old myths were not dead. They stirred in his blood like forgotten embers. He wrote once as a young man, "They call the gods illusions, yet I feel them in the wind, in the warmth of the sun, in the order of the stars. If illusion can breathe and burn, then perhaps truth itself wears many faces." By day he studied Christian theology, memorizing the Psalms to please his tutors. By night he whispered hymns to Apollo beneath his breath. 2 worlds warred inside him, the faith of his forefathers, and the creed of those who had murdered them. Every lesson, every prayer, every silence sharpened him. Years later, when the empire would call him apostate, it would forget this. That apostasy is born not from arrogance, but from grief. Julian's grief was ancient. He once dreamed, or thought he did, of a burning city. Statues toppled, temples in ash, a figure of light standing upon the ruins. The figure turned to him and spoke with 2 voices, one divine, one human. "Choose your God, child, but know that he will not choose you." When he awoke, dawn had broken over Nicomedia. The bells of the new basilica tolled through the mist. Julian did not pray that morning. He merely watched the light shift across the hills and whispered to the rising sun, "Then I will choose myself." Years passed, and the boy became a scholar, not by choice, but by exile. The empire had spared him, but only under watchful eyes. At every step, bishops and soldiers shadowed him like omens. He lived within the cold walls of Macellum in Cappadocia, a place called a school, though it was more a prison for imperial blood. The seasons changed, but the stone never did. Winters howled through its corridors and summer heat made the air shimmer like glass. There, Julian's world shrank to ink and parchment, to whispers among the other exiled youths. His tutors were Christians, stern, learned, unyielding. Yet their discipline forged something they could not see, a mind too sharp to be chained by doctrine. At night he would climb to the roof and watch the stars. He named them after gods his teachers had forbidden him to speak of. Hermes, Artemis, Zeus. He wondered if those lights, so constant and distant, still remembered their altars in the days before the cross. In one surviving letter, Julian wrote, "I do not hate the Galilean. I hate that men have made his peace a sword." He saw what the empire had become, a kingdom of faith enforced by fear, of sermons spoken beside the executioner's blade. Even as a boy, he sensed the fracture growing within Rome's soul. The old and the new, the seen and the unseen, each clawing at the other for dominion over men's hearts. His half-brother Gallus, older and more reckless, rose quickly in imperial favor. Gallus wore his wounds like medals, Julian his silence like armor. When Gallus was named Caesar and sent to Antioch, the empire watched him with suspicion. Ambition burned bright in his eyes, too bright. Julian visited him once before the end. In a dim courtyard filled with the scent of citrus and dust, Gallus clasped his brother's hand and whispered, "Do not trust them, Julian. Not the priests, not the generals, not the courtiers who smile as they measure your worth and usefulness. They will call us princes, then make us prisoners." Julian remembered that warning for the rest of his life. Soon after, word reached him. Gallus was dead. Executed on orders from the Emperor Constantius, their own cousin. Officially for treason, unofficially for being too much a Julian, Julian fell to his knees when he heard the world spinning into shadow. The last tether to his family, gone. He wrote later, in a private diary never meant for eyes but his own, "I am a man whom destiny has robbed of everything but thought, and so thought shall be my weapon." From that moment, the scholar began to harden into something else. The empire still watched him, but it also began to use him. Constantius, perhaps fearing what he might become, summoned him to the imperial court, first as an observer, then as a pawn. Julian obeyed. He bowed, smiled, said little, but behind those calm eyes burned a secret vow. Never again would he be the child hiding under a table while his world bled out. When he rode into Constantinople for the first time, the city seemed alive. Gold domes gleaming beneath sea-blue skies, markets alive with the scent of wine and sea salt, and 1,000 tongues shouting praise to a god he had never felt. Yet beneath it all lay the pulse of something older, something deeper. The stones themselves remembered the empire before it knelt. In the evenings, Julian walked alone along the harbor, where fishermen sang to the waves and the last light of day turned the water to molten copper. There, among the salt and smoke, he made his decision. He would live. He would serve, and when the time came, he would reclaim what his blood had lost. The inheritance of fire was not just a name, but a promise that even in exile, even in silence, flame remembers how to burn. The court of Constantius was a theater of gold and fear. Marble floors gleamed like mirrors, and the scent of myrrh drifted through halls where every smile was an act, every whisper a blade. Julian, ever the observer, learned to walk these corridors like a man crossing thin ice. He bowed when spoken to, studied when ignored, and listened when others lied. Constantius, seated upon the throne of his father, ruled with the piety of a saint and the suspicion of a tyrant. He looked upon Julian with that curious mixture of blood and doubt. To him, the young man was both heir and threat, too clever to kill outright, too useful to discard. So the emperor kept him close. Julian, in turn, watched and remembered. He saw the generals fawn and flatter, the bishops squabble over doctrine while famine gnawed at the frontiers. He saw an empire losing its gods not because they were false, but because men no longer believed in anything beyond their own safety. In that quiet despair, Julian found his faith not in the cross or in Jupiter, but in the idea that man himself could rise toward the divine. Philosophy became his altar, knowledge his prayer. He began to correspond with philosophers in secret, among them a mystic named Maximus of Ephesus, a man whose voice carried the weight of the old world. Maximus spoke of light as essence, of the cosmos as a living hymn. When they met, Julian felt as if a door had opened somewhere inside him, one he had always known was there but never dared to touch. "I have seen the gods," Maximus told him, in a voice like storm wind. "Not as statues, not as myths, but as powers that dwell within order, beauty, and reason. Serve them not by worship, but by wisdom." Julian listened, and in that moment, the boy who had once trembled in the dark understood what the fire within him was for. The lineage of Julian was not meant to rule in marble halls. It was meant to awaken Rome itself, and though the empire did not yet know it, the orphan prince of the massacre would soon become its savior, or its heretic. Either way, destiny had begun to stir. Snow fell like ash across the Rhine frontier. The world had turned to silver and silence. In the distance, the faint roar of the river echoed beneath a sky the color of lead. The Roman camp, a maze of tents and frozen fires, lay quiet except for the hiss of wind threading through the banners. Julian stood by the rampart, his cloak heavy with frost, his breath rising in pale clouds. He had been in Gaul for a year, and already it had taught him what no philosopher ever could. Here, truth was written in the mud and the blood of men. The empire's western provinces were breaking. The tribes had crossed the Rhine, burning villages, capturing towns, tearing down the borders Rome once thought eternal. The legions had grown weary of losing, weary of waiting for orders from faraway emperors who spoke of faith while men froze in their armor. When Julian arrived, few believed he would survive the winter. A scholar sent to command soldiers, a dreamer sent to stop a war. The generals mocked him behind closed doors. The troops called him the student prince, but he listened. He learned. He walked among the soldiers at night, sharing their bread, warming his hands by their fires. He asked for no gold, only their stories. Slowly the laughter returned to the camps. Slowly the name Julian began to carry the weight of trust. One evening, a veteran named Flavius approached him with eyes as tired as the stars. "Caesar," he said, his voice low, "why fight for an empire that forgets its own sons?" Julian looked at the man's cracked hands, the frost biting his skin, and answered, "Because someone must remember them." That night, he wrote to his friend Oribasius, "I once believed wisdom was found only in the stillness of thought. Now I see it in the noise of the world. A leader's duty is not to rule from the temples of mind, but from the wounds of men." When the snows began to melt, he marched. His first campaign was against the Alemanni, who had taken the city of Cologne. The roads were rivers of ice. The wind knifed through armor. Yet Julian rode at the front, his face uncovered, his cloak snapping like a banner. When the city fell, the soldiers looked upon him with new eyes. No longer the student prince, but the commander who had faced death beside them. By the time spring touched the land, the legions of Gaul followed him not by command, but by faith. They sang his name when they marched. They whispered his victories across the camps like prayer, but in Constantinople such prayers were dangerous. The Emperor Constantius began to hear of his cousin's success, and with each victory Julian won, another seed of suspicion was sown in the palace halls. The empire had room for many gods, but never two sons. The snows receded, leaving behind a land scarred by battle and frost. In every ruined village, the air still smelled of smoke and wet earth. Farmers crept from hiding, their faces hollow, their fields turned to graves. Julian rode through them with his cloak drawn tight, the weight of victory pressing heavier than defeat ever had. He ordered bread distributed from the army stores, rebuilt roads where the empire had forgotten them, and wrote to Constantius, "Peace cannot be restored by fire alone. The sword may defend, but it cannot heal." No reply came. In the camps, men spoke of rebellion, though no one dared name it. They had seen too many winters under emperors who ruled from afar, sending prayers instead of pay, decrees instead of hope. Yet when Julian walked among them, the talk fell silent. He did not ask for their loyalty. He earned it in the way he stood beside them when the wind turned cruel, in the way he listened when they spoke of sons lost and homes burned. He rode at dawn and slept at midnight. His armor was battered, his hands calloused. In a world of hollow titles, he was a man who bled as they did. When word spread that the Alemanni were gathering again beyond the Rhine, Julian called for counsel. The older generals advised retreat until the emperor could send reinforcements. Julian looked out across the river, its black waters crawling with mist, and said quietly, "If we wait for Rome, Gaul will burn before the spring returns." The time for letters is over. The silence that followed was deep. Then Flavius, the veteran who once questioned him, struck his fist against the table. Then we follow you, Caesar, for Rome and for the living. The cheers that rose in that tent carried across the camp like thunder. Before dawn, they crossed the Rhine. Torches guttered in the cold wind. The river roared beneath their feet. They moved swiftly, silently, the fog swallowing the sound of their march. When the enemy came upon them in the valley of Argenteratum, the clash was sudden and terrible. Steel screamed against steel. Horses reared. The earth shook beneath the weight of war. Julian fought in the thick of it, his spear shattering, his shield splintered, his voice rising above the din. For hours the line held. Then, as the sun broke through the clouds, the Alemanni began to fall back. The Romans, weary but unbroken, pressed forward. By nightfall, the valley was theirs. The victory was complete. The Rhine frontier secure once more. When the soldiers lifted Julian upon their shields, shouting his name, the wind carried their cries far into the forest. In that moment, the philosopher had become something greater, a ruler forged not by decree but by the faith of men. Yet even as the banners rose in triumph, Julian felt the shadow of another storm gathering far away. For victory had made him beloved. And in Rome, love was the one crime emperors could not forgive. Autumn crept over Gaul like a slow fire. Fields turned gold, the rivers darkened with rain, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke. In the camps, soldiers mended their cloaks and spoke softly of home. For the first time in years, peace had returned to the frontier. Julian rode along the Rhine, the wind lifting his hair as he looked toward the lands he had saved. Yet peace, he knew, was never a gift. It was a loan from destiny, waiting to be reclaimed with interest. Letters from Constantinople arrived more frequently now, written in the emperor's sharp, impatient hand. They praised him in one breath and demanded obedience in the next. Julian was ordered to send half his legions east to serve under Constantius in his Persian campaign. The men heard of it and grew restless. They had fought, bled, and starved beside Julian. They would not march for another's glory. In the dark of night, the camp gathered. Fires burned low, their light flickering on faces carved by war. One by one, the soldiers knelt before Julian's tent, laying their swords upon the ground. Their voices rose together, not as a chant, but as a vow. "Lead us, Augustus." Julian stepped into the cold, the torchlight reflecting in his eyes. "You know what you ask," he said.
"This is treason." Flavius, the old veteran, answered for them all.
"Then let us be traitors to fear." Then Julian placed his hand upon the nearest sword. "So be it." The shout that followed shook the camp to its core. Shields clanged, horns sounded, and the cry spread through the night like wildfire. "Julian Augustus, Julian Emperor." In that instant, the philosopher of Athens, the exile of Cappadocia, the scholar mocked as unfit for command, became master of an empire. Yet beneath the triumph, he felt the weight of what had begun. The snows of winter would soon return, and with them, the reckoning. Far to the east, Constantius stirred, his armies still vast, his pride unbroken. 2 emperors now ruled Rome, and in the frozen silence of Gaul, the winds whispered a warning. The fire that had begun as inheritance now threatened to consume the world. The sea wind smelled of salt and jasmine. From the deck of a small galley approaching Athens, Julian lifted his eyes to the horizon where the Acropolis rose like a crown of pale stone. The city shimmered in the sunlight, its columns gleaming as if carved from the breath of gods. Bells rang in distant temples. Laughter drifted across the water. For a moment he could almost believe the world was whole again. Athens was not merely a city. It was memory itself, preserved in marble and myth. Here men still spoke of Plato as though he had walked their streets that morning, and of Homer as if his verses had been written only yesterday. For Julian, it was a kind of homecoming to a world he had never known. He was 20 years old, weary of politics and prayer, hungry for wisdom. In his letters he had begged for permission to study there, to lose himself in philosophy before the empire demanded his service. Miraculously, Constantius had allowed it. Perhaps the emperor believed education would tame him. He was wrong. Julian spent his days among scholars and mystics, debating in sunlit courtyards, writing until his fingers cramped. His teachers spoke of form and virtue, of the soul's ascent toward the eternal. They spoke of truth not as a commandment, but as discovery. For the first time in his life, Julian breathed freely. He walked the streets at dusk when the city glowed in the fire of countless oil lamps. Philosophers argued beneath the plane trees. Children ran through the markets, laughing. From every corner came the hum of voices praising wisdom, not conquest. It felt like a dream Rome had long forgotten. But the dream was fragile. Beyond Athens, the empire groaned beneath its own weight. In the west, soldiers muttered of unpaid wages. In the east, the Persians pressed harder against the borders. In the north, tribes tested the empire's crumbling defenses. And at its heart, religion had become a battlefield. Letters from the capital reached him like echoes from another world. Bishops denounced one another in councils that resembled trials more than worship. The cross had become a standard of war. Julian, reading these reports by lamplight, would close his eyes and whisper, "Christ was meant to bring peace. How have we made him a weapon?" Still, he stayed in Athens, trying to find an answer in reason. One evening, he attended a gathering at the home of a philosopher named Priscus. The air was thick with the scent of burning cedar and honeyed wine. Candles flickered against walls lined with scrolls. There he met Libanius, the famed rhetorician, sharp-tongued, brilliant, and fearless. "You carry Rome in your blood," Libanius told him, pouring a cup of wine. "But do you carry her soul?" Julian smiled faintly. "Perhaps I am trying to find it." Libanius studied him. "Then beware, young Julian. The empire no longer honors thinkers. It devours them." The words hung between them like smoke. Outside, thunder rolled over the sea. From that night on, Julian's writings changed. His notes grew urgent, his arguments edged with sorrow. He spoke of the gods not as relics but as ideas, living principles of balance and beauty. He wrote that man could not live by dogma alone, for dogma silences wonder. And so, in the quiet hours before dawn, the scholar became something else. Not a rebel yet, but a believer in the old harmony. The fire that had once burned in exile began to glow again, steady and sure. He knew that soon the world would come knocking, and this time he would not hide. It was spring when the letter arrived. The wax seal bore the imperial eagle, its edges still warm from the messenger's hand. Julian broke it carefully, though his pulse already knew what it would contain. "By decree of the Augustus Constantius, you are hereby summoned to service. You shall present yourself at Milan to receive the honors and duties befitting your station." In the silence that followed, the room seemed to darken. The hum of the Athenian streets faded beyond the walls. He read the letter again, then folded it once and set it beside his lamp. The wax cracked like brittle bone. He had always known this day would come. Philosophy, for all its peace, had been only a reprieve. Rome did not allow its bloodline to rest. That night, Julian walked to the steps of the Parthenon. The moon hung high, a white coin cast into an ocean of darkness. The city slept, but he remained still beneath the columns, staring at the goddess whose face time had worn smooth. He whispered, "Athena, give me clarity. If I must serve, let me do it with a clean heart." The wind answered, soft and warm, as if the goddess breathed. But in that whisper was no comfort, only resolve. By dawn, he was gone. The journey to Milan took months. Across the plains of Thrace, the forests of Moesia, the cold rivers of Illyricum, he traveled with few companions and fewer words. Along the roads, he saw the empire not as a scholar but as a witness. Villages half empty, fields untended, soldiers begging for pay, priests arguing at every crossroads. Rome was no longer the Rome of his readings. It was an old god dying slowly, its body covered with gold to disguise the decay beneath. When he reached Milan, the court awaited like a stage. Constantius sat upon a throne of ivory and silk, his face pale beneath the crown, his eyes sharp with the fatigue of ruling too long. Around him stood bishops, generals, and flatterers, the empire's new pantheon. Julian knelt. "I serve Rome as my fathers did." Constantius regarded him for a long, uneasy moment. "You serve me, cousin," he said at last, "and Rome through me." So began the next chapter of his captivity. He was given quarters within the palace, attendants to watch him, priests to guide him. But the gold walls felt colder than any cell. Every meal, every ceremony, every whispered rumor was a reminder that he was not trusted, only tolerated. And yet something in him began to stir again. Beneath the caution and calculation, the scholar saw opportunity. He began to speak with the officers of the court, to learn the language of the army, the movements of power. He listened when the old generals muttered about the frontiers, when they spoke of Gaul and the threat of the Germanic tribes. He memorized every weakness in the empire's chain. To them he was merely the quiet philosopher cousin. To himself he was gathering pieces of a destiny that refused to die. One evening, while the court dined, a Christian bishop began to preach on loyalty and divine order. His voice rose over the sound of wine and laughter, proclaiming that the emperor ruled by God's will alone. Julian looked up from his cup and said softly, "Then let us pray that the gods choose wisely." The hall fell silent. The bishop frowned. Constantius' eyes narrowed. And in that moment something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, perhaps even fear. For the first time the emperor saw not a scholar, but a spark. That night Julian wrote by candlelight, "If fate commands me to serve, then I will serve as the storm serves the sea." Unwillingly, but with purpose. He did not know it yet, but the gods were already preparing his path to the frontier, where the prince would become something far greater and far more dangerous than the philosopher he had once been. Weeks passed in the gilded cage of Milan. Outside, banners fluttered in the spring wind. Inside, intrigue hummed like a swarm of bees beneath the marble calm. Julian moved through it all like a shadow, silent and watchful, his every word measured, his every gesture studied. Then came the announcement. Constantius, weary of war and rebellion, needed a loyal hand to govern the western provinces. Gaul, torn by raids, rebellion, and despair. His generals had failed him. His treasury was bleeding. His legions had grown restless. He turned to the one man whose loyalty he thought he could control. Julian. The court murmured when the decree was read. Some smiled, others whispered prayers. To send the emperor's young cousin into the storm seemed either madness or brilliance. Julian bowed and accepted without protest. But inside something blazed, not fear, but freedom. On the eve of his departure, he walked once more through the palace gardens. The fountains whispered, and the air smelled faintly of myrtle and rain. He thought of Athens, of starlit nights of reason, of laughter echoing across marble courtyards. That world now felt impossibly distant. Ahead lay only mud, steel, and cold wind. A single letter arrived from Libanius before he left. Its ink was dark and hurried. "Philosopher, remember this, the power is not the enemy of wisdom. It is its test. Do not let the crown make you forget what your mind has already conquered." Julian folded the letter and tucked it against his heart. At dawn, he mounted his horse. The soldiers saluted half-heartedly, unsure whether they were witnessing a promotion or a sentence. The gates of Milan opened, and the philosopher rode out beneath a sky streaked with pale gold. Behind him, the bells of the churches rang for morning prayer. Ahead, the road to Gaul wound through mist and silence. He did not look back. For the first time, the wind did not feel like exile. It felt like calling. And though he rode toward a land of frost and battle, his mind burned with the words he would one day write. The world is not saved by faith alone. It is saved by those who dare to understand it. Dawn broke over Constantinople like a whisper of gold across the sea. The waters of the Bosporus shimmered, and the domes of the great city blazed with the first light of morning. Bells rang from churches, mingling with the distant cry of gulls and the murmur of priests at prayer. On that morning, the empire woke to a new ruler. Julian had entered the city not in triumph but in silence. Constantius was dead, taken by illness before their civil war could begin. The hand of fate had cleared his path. No blood on the sword, no siege, no betrayal. Only an empty throne waiting for a man who had spent his life denied it. The streets were lined with faces, cautious and curious. Some shouted his name, others watched in wary silence. The air smelled of rain and incense, of salt and iron. As his horse clattered over the stones, Julian's eyes rose to the walls that gleamed like marble flame. The city of Constantine, heart of the empire, pulsed beneath his gaze. He dismounted at the steps of the palace. The senators bowed. The generals knelt. Bishops stood at a distance, their robes dark against the marble. Julian looked upon them all and felt the old fire stir. For years he had bowed, obeyed, and studied the art of surviving among those who feared him. Now at last survival had become rule. He spoke quietly, his voice carrying through the open court. Rome is not a corpse to be embalmed with faith. It is a living flame, and I will see it burn bright again. Whispers rippled through the assembly. Some smiled, others crossed themselves. None yet knew what those words would mean. That night, as rain swept over the city, Julian sat alone in the imperial study. Scrolls lay open before him. Plato, Marcus Aurelius, Homer. The candlelight wavered across their worn edges. On the wall behind him hung a cross of gold. He turned to it for a long moment, eyes unreadable. Then gently he covered it with a tapestry of the sun. It was not blasphemy in his heart, but restoration. He did not seek to destroy the Galilean faith, only to free the empire from the chains of one vision. To him, truth had never belonged to one altar. It lived in philosophy and beauty in the order of the stars. The old temples, long silent, began to open again. Statues once hidden in dust were washed clean, their faces touched by the light. Sacrifices returned, not of blood but of song and incense. Philosophers were summoned from exile, scholars restored to their chairs, poets invited to the court. The empire began to breathe in color again. And yet, beneath the rising hymn of the old gods, another sound lingered, the low murmur of resentment. The bishops spoke in whispers that spread like shadow. In the streets, priests warned of the emperor's soul. The people, divided between memory and faith, looked to heaven for signs. In those uneasy days, Julian wrote in his journal, "Let them call me apostate if they must. I seek only to unite what time and fear have divided. If the gods and the Galilean are both true, then let the truth reveal itself in reason, not in chains." He believed he could heal Rome by returning its heart to its beginning. He did not yet see that the past was not a foundation, but a flame that could not be contained. The empire glittered like a reflection in water, beautiful but fractured. From Antioch to Alexandria, his name spread through the marble streets and crowded markets. To some, Julian was philosopher and savior. To others, heretic and pretender. He traveled eastward, seeking not conquest but communion. The temples of Apollo, Artemis, and Mithras reopened to songs unheard for generations. He walked among the priests, speaking not as emperor but as brother. His hands touched the ancient stones, his eyes lifted toward the sky as if searching for the voice of the divine in the turning of the heavens. In the great temple at Daphne, the air was thick with incense. The statue of Apollo shone with new gold, its face restored to brilliance. Yet when Julian entered, he found the altar cold. The priests murmured that the Christians had cursed it, that the god had withdrawn his favor. Julian knelt before the statue, his voice barely a whisper. "Return, Lord of Light. Let Rome see again through your eyes." That night lightning struck the roof of the temple. Flames devoured the cedar beams. By dawn, all that remained of Apollo's house was smoke and ash. The people called it a sign from the Galilean. The bishops rejoiced. But Julian stood before the ruins, his face pale with anger and sorrow. "The god is not dead," he said softly. "He is silenced." He ordered no revenge, though his generals urged it. Instead, he summoned philosophers, astrologers, and poets to his side. They gathered in the royal court, crafting rituals, reviving forgotten hymns, weaving together fragments of faith as if to build a bridge back to eternity. He believed he could resurrect the soul of Rome through wisdom. Yet wisdom alone could not command the hearts of men. Outside the marble halls, the world turned restless. In Antioch, the people mocked his sacrifices. Bread grew scarce. The markets filled with whispers that the emperor spent more time praying to invisible gods than feeding his own. Julian walked through those streets disguised, listening to the laughter that cut like knives. He heard them call him the Greek and the dreamer. He saw children chasing dogs through the temple courts where he had prayed. That night, he wrote again in his journal, "Perhaps I ask too much of mortals. They want bread, not beauty. They want miracles, not meaning." Yet his conviction did not waver. He believed that the empire's sickness was not of hunger or poverty, but of spirit. He dreamed of an age where philosophy would be priesthood, where light would be law, and where men would seek virtue instead of victory. But his dream was already collapsing beneath the weight of time. In Constantinople, his decrees were met with resistance. The Christian bishops defied him openly, refusing to yield their churches or their followers. In Rome itself, the Senate hesitated, uncertain which god ruled their emperor's heart. Julian's patience thinned. For the first time, his voice rose in anger. They speak of love and forgiveness, yet they curse their brothers. They claim peace, yet they build power. Is this faith, or is it empire disguised? His words were not shouted in hatred, but in despair. He was a man at war with ghosts, of gods long forgotten, of emperors long dead, of his own childhood where faith and fear had walked hand in hand. And though he ruled the greatest empire on earth, Julian felt increasingly alone within it. Winter came to Antioch like a shroud of dust. The olive groves withered, the markets emptied, and the great colonnades echoed with silence. In the palace, Julian worked late into the night, his lamp burning low beside stacks of scrolls. Reports arrived daily: unrest in Egypt, mutiny in Thrace, rumors of Persian armies gathering beyond the Tigris. The empire, once his canvas of renewal, was splintering beneath the weight of belief and disbelief alike. He still held to hope. Every dawn he walked to the temple hill overlooking the city, his cloak heavy with dew, his breath curling into the cold air. He prayed not for victory but for understanding. The sky answered only with wind. One evening, as thunder rolled over the horizon, a messenger entered the chamber bearing a sealed letter from his generals. The Persians had crossed the frontier. Their king, Shapur, was advancing with fire and vengeance. Julian read the letter in silence, then looked toward the darkening window. The reflection that stared back at him was older than the man who had left Gaul. The philosopher was gone. What remained was a ruler who had wagered his soul on an empire's memory. He turned to his officers. The gods are testing Rome. We will meet them where the world ends. The court erupted in preparation. Spears were forged, banners unfurled. The great legions of the East summoned once more. In the final days before his departure, Julian wrote to a friend in Athens, "I go to the war not as conqueror but as servant. If the gods still dwell among men, let them speak now, through the dust of battle." When the dawn of departure came, the streets of Antioch were silent. Few came to watch the emperor ride. The priests had turned away. The philosophers stood with unreadable eyes, and the people prayed to different heavens. Julian paused at the city gate, his armor gleaming faintly in the morning light. For a moment he looked back toward the temples on the hill, where smoke still drifted from dying altars. Then he turned eastward toward the rising sun, where the empire's fate awaited him. The last pagan was marching to meet his gods. The eastern desert stretched before the Roman army like a sea of bronze and fire. The air shimmered with heat. The sand whispered beneath the tread of thousands. Above them the sun burned without mercy. Yet Julian rode at the front, his armor reflecting the light like a living flame. Behind him marched 60,000 men, banners of crimson and gold rippling in the wind. They sang the songs of Gaul and Italy, of home and hearth, though their voices grew weaker with each passing mile. The Euphrates flowed beside them, slow and wide, its waters glinting with dust. Along its banks the ruins of ancient kingdoms rose like ghosts, reminders that even empires of marble fall to the silence of time. Julian looked upon those ruins and felt their warning. Yet he pressed forward. He had planned this campaign with the precision of a scholar and the faith of a priest. To strike at the heart of Persia, to bring the fire of Rome into the shadowed halls of Shapur's throne. He believed that victory would unite his people, restore the divine favor he felt slipping from their grasp. At night, the army camped beneath a sky dense with stars. The fires flickered low, the air thick with dust and song. Julian would walk among the soldiers, speaking quietly, his words half encouragement, half philosophy. The soul of Rome, he told them, is not in its walls or its coins, but in the courage of those who march when the world seems lost. They listened, weary but moved, for he spoke not as emperor but as one of them. Days turned to weeks. The heat grew fierce, the rivers shallow, the food scarce. Yet still they advanced. Cities fell in their path. Persian garrisons scattered before them, and the standard of Rome rose once more upon the farthest frontier. Then came Ctesiphon, the jewel of the Persian kings. Its white walls gleamed across the river like a mirage. The Romans stood upon the opposite bank, their hearts lifting at the sight. But the river was wide and swift, and Shapur's forces waited beyond, their banners dark as storm clouds. Julian ordered the engineers to prepare for crossing. The men labored through the night, building bridges of boats, their hammers echoing across the water. Yet by dawn the Persians struck. Arrows fell like rain, the river churned red, and the bridges caught flame. The Romans fought fiercely, pushing forward step by step, their shields gleaming in the rising sun. Julian himself rode into the fray, his voice carrying above the roar of battle. "Hold the line. Rome does not yield to shadows." By dusk the enemy had fallen back, but Ctesiphon remained beyond their reach, and the river ran thick with death. That night, as smoke drifted across the camps, Julian stood alone beside the water. His reflection trembled in the current, rippling with every gust of wind. He whispered to the unseen sky, "Is this the test you promised me?" The stars did not answer. Only the river replied, murmuring with the voices of the lost. In that silence he made his decision. He would not retreat. He would march deeper into Persia, into the heart of the empire's oldest rival, and force destiny to reveal its final face. The army followed him, though the maps ended and the roads turned to dust. Behind them, the bridges burned. Ahead, the horizon wavered like a dream of fire. Julian led them onward into the unknown. The land grew harsher with every mile. The rivers vanished, replaced by salt and stone. Wind swept over the dunes, carrying the scent of desolation. The sun hung like a hammer above the world. The men marched slower now, their armor heavy, their lips cracked with thirst. Yet Julian did not falter. He rode with them through the dust, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his voice steady. He refused to wear a crown or travel under shade. When food ran low, he ate the same ration of stale bread and dried figs as the lowest soldier. When the wounded fell behind, he turned his horse and lifted them up himself. To those who followed him, he seemed almost immortal. To his enemies, he seemed touched by madness. Then came the desert of Samara, where the sand burned beneath the feet and the wind tore the breath from their throats. The scouts brought grim news. The Persians were closing in from every direction, their horsemen swift as smoke. Julian ordered the army into formation, shields locked, spears braced. The sun was sinking, the air glowing red with heat. Across the plain the enemy appeared, riders draped in silver, their banners black against the light. The two armies faced each other in a silence deeper than fear. Then without signal the battle began. The clash was like thunder. Spears shattered, horses screamed, and dust rose so thick that day became night. The Persians swept around the flanks, loosing arrows that cut through armor and flesh. The Romans held their ground step by step, their shields glistening with sweat and blood. Julian rode through the storm, shouting orders, his cloak torn by arrows. He carried no helmet, only the gleam of conviction in his eyes. When a messenger called for him to withdraw to safety, he shook his head. An emperor does not watch his men die from a distance. Then, as the battle raged, a cry rose from the front. A spear flashed through the smoke and struck him beneath the ribs. He staggered, clutching his side, his face pale beneath the grime. His guards rushed to his aid, but he waved them off, trying to stand. "It is nothing," he said, though his hand was wet with blood. "Hold the line." They carried him from the field as the fighting continued, the sky now burning with the red of sunset. He was laid beneath a tattered tent, his breathing shallow, the light fading from his eyes. Around him his officers gathered, silent and trembling. The sounds of battle drifted in like echoes from another world. Julian looked toward the open flap of the tent, where the last light of day poured in, golden and soft. "Have I failed them?" he whispered. "No, my lord," said Flavius, his voice breaking. "You gave Rome her soul again." Julian smiled faintly. "Then let her keep it." Outside, the shouts of victory began to rise. The Persians were retreating, their lines broken. But the emperor no longer heard them. He lifted his gaze to the heavens, his lips forming words only the wind could carry. "O sun, if I have lived in your light, receive me in your fire." Then, as night fell upon the desert, the last pagan emperor closed his eyes. The dawn after Julian's death came without song. The desert was still. The wind had softened as if mourning him. His body lay beneath a linen shroud, his face calm, untouched by the violence that had taken him. The soldiers gathered in silence, their armor dull with dust and grief. No emperor had fallen so far from the marble of Rome, nor risen so high in the memory of those who followed him. He had sought not to conquer lands, but to conquer time itself, to reclaim the soul of an empire that had forgotten its beginning. Yet the empire, like the gods he worshipped, was bound to fade. They buried him at dawn, the light spreading across the endless sands. The priests whispered prayers neither Christian nor pagan, unsure which heaven to send him to. When the final stone was placed, the army stood at attention, shields pressed to their chests, a silent farewell to the man who had led them beyond the world they knew. Far away in Constantinople, word reached the Senate. Some wept, others whispered of divine justice. The churches rang with hymns of victory. Yet in the quiet corners of the city, philosophers wrote his name into history with trembling hands. Julian's dream had ended, but its echo lingered. The old gods would fade, but their light, refracted through centuries, would still glimmer in the art, the words, and the spirit of those who remembered that reason, too, was sacred. As the desert winds covered the traces of the Roman camp, one could almost hear the faint echo of his voice carried through the dust. Rome is not what it owns, but what it believes. And so the empire turned another page. In the distance, the torches of new emperors flickered. The Senate would rise again in ambition and fall again in pride, shaping the fate of Rome long after the gods had gone silent. The story of empire was far from over. For in the next chapter of history, we turn to those who ruled not with swords, but with words, the men who believed they could hold a republic in their hands and lost it to the weight of their own power. If this story moved you, let your support carry it onward. Like and subscribe to walk with us further into the forgotten corridors of history, where power, pride, and destiny continue to echo. End of The Julian Lineage, Blood and the Price of Empire.